The gymnasium at the Chinatown District branch of the Los Angeles Athletic Club seated 412 people on the night of March 9, 1971. Every seat was filled. The folding chairs ran to the edges of the room, arranged in 6 rows on 3 sides of a raised demonstration floor. And along the fourth wall, the standing crowd had pressed itself 3 bodies deep against the plaster. It was 7 minutes past 9 in the evening. The overhead lights were the kind that hummed if you listened for them. Most people in that room were listening for something else entirely. His name was Raymond Chu. He was 26 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, and weighed 187 pounds. He had trained for 11 consecutive years without a documented loss on American soil, and in 2 separate trips to Hong Kong, he had earned commendations from tournament officials who described his footwork in formal correspondence as mechanically extraordinary. He held black belts in 2 separate disciplines. He had sparred with men who were later inducted into martial arts halls of record. He was not a fraud. He was not a pretender. The people in that room who knew the arts understood what they were watching when Raymond Chu moved, and what they understood was that he was very, very good. The old master sat in the 7th chair of the 3rd row on the east side of the room. His name was Yip Kin. He was 68 years old. He had come to Los Angeles 4 years earlier from Foshan, and he had spent those 4 years teaching a small group of 12 students in a rented space above a hardware store on Hill Street. He did not advertise. He did not give demonstrations. He had, in his career, produced 2 students of notable reputation, and he had never once spoken publicly about either of them. He wore a plain gray jacket that evening. He kept his hands folded in his lap. He did not watch Raymond Chu the way the rest of the room watched Raymond Chu. He watched him the way a man watches weather. The person sitting directly to Yip Kin's left was 30 years old. He had arrived wearing a dark jacket over a plain white shirt, and he had come in through the side entrance with 2 other men without speaking to anyone at the door. He was not tall. He did not take up a great deal of space in his chair. He had been introduced to Yip Kin 11 months earlier by a mutual contact in the San Francisco arts community, and in those 11 months he had driven to the Hill Street studio 7 times. He had never once asked Yip Kin to teach him anything. He had asked, each time, only to watch. His name was Bruce Lee. Nobody in that room, except the 2 men sitting beside him, knew he was there. In 4 minutes and 31 seconds, Raymond Chu was going to say something that nobody in that room would be able to unhear for the rest of their lives. And in the 17 seconds that followed that moment, what happened on that floor would be replayed in martial arts schools across 3 continents for the next 5 decades. If you want to know what was said from that floor when it was over, and why Bruce Lee never spoke of this night in any interview he gave for the remaining 2 years of his life, stay with this until the end. Raymond Chu had been the featured demonstrator that evening for 40 minutes before the moment arrived. He had moved through a series of forms and then a sequence of controlled exchanges with 2 of his senior students, and the room had applauded twice without being prompted. The applause was not polite applause. It was the applause of people who understood what they were seeing and were grateful to see it. His kicking combinations operated at a speed that made several trained observers in the room recalibrate their private assessments of what human speed actually was. The tournament director for the Western Region Karate Association, a man named Gerald Finch, who had officiated 483 competitive bouts in 14 years, sat in the front row with a legal pad on his knee and did not write a single note for the entirety of those 40 minutes. He simply watched. Later he would tell 3 people separately that watching Raymond Chu move was the closest he had come, in his professional life, to witnessing something he did not have language for. Then the 40 minutes ended, and Raymond Chu took the microphone. He spoke for 6 minutes. In the first 4, he discussed his training philosophy and the lineage of his primary instructor. The room was attentive and respectful. Then, in the 5th minute, something shifted in his voice. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the shift that occurs when a man who has been performing transitions into a man who is speaking from somewhere more private, and the room felt it before it understood it. He said that the traditional arts had a problem, and the problem was sentiment. He said that too many teachers in this city were being honored not for what they could still produce, but for what they had once produced, and that this distinction mattered more than the community was willing to admit publicly. He paused. He looked out at the room. He said that there was a teacher present this evening whose reputation he had heard cited many times in recent months, and that he meant no disrespect in what he was about to say, but that reputation built on private rooms and small classes and the endorsements of 2 former students was not the same as reputation built on the floor. He said Yip Kin's name. He said that he had asked twice, through intermediaries, for an exchange of ideas, and that both requests had been declined, and that he understood the right to decline, but that he wished to say, in this room, in front of these witnesses, that what cannot be demonstrated should not be vouched for, and that he was prepared, this evening, with full respect for the elder's years, to offer that demonstration himself, on behalf of clarity. The room went very quiet, not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of a held breath. Gerald Finch set his legal pad down on the floor beside his chair. Yip Kin did not move. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the floor in front of his feet, and for 11 seconds he did not respond in any visible way to what had just been said about him in public, in his presence, by a man 42 years his junior. The person to his left moved first. Bruce Lee did not stand quickly. He did not stand dramatically. He placed both hands on his knees, pushed himself upright in a single unhurried motion, and adjusted the front of his jacket with 2 fingers. He set the jacket over the back of his chair. He folded it once along the collar. He set it down deliberately, with both hands, and he smoothed the lapel flat. Then, he turned toward the demonstration floor and began to walk. If you are subscribed to this channel, you already know what the next 17 seconds contained, and you know that no description of them has ever been entirely adequate. If you are new here and you want to find out exactly what happened, second by second, make sure you are subscribed now and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. The room recognized him before he reached the edge of the raised floor. It moved through the crowd the way a temperature change moves through a room. It began at the back left corner and spread diagonally across the seated section until it reached the standing wall. And it did not produce noise. It produced stillness. A different kind of stillness than the one Raymond Chu's words had created. That stillness had been the stillness of shock. This one was the stillness of recognition, and it carried weight. Raymond Chu watched him approach. His expression did not change. He was too good for that, too trained, too schooled in the discipline of not reacting before information was complete. He watched Bruce Lee climb the 2 steps onto the demonstration floor and stop. He calculated the distance between them, which was 11 feet. He held the microphone at his side. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he looked past him, at nothing in particular on the far wall. Then he looked back. He said 2 words. He said, "Show me." He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He stood in street shoes on a demonstration floor in front of 400 people, and he said 2 words. And the words were not a challenge. They were an invitation. They were the most dangerous kind of invitation. The kind that cannot be declined without cost. Because to decline them was to answer the very question Raymond Chu had posed from the microphone. Raymond Chu did not decline. He handed the microphone to the student nearest him. He rolled his right shoulder once. He brought his hands up into his preferred guard, which was a high-line Western boxing guard, modified with the rear hand dropped 4 inches lower than orthodox position. A modification he had developed himself over 3 years of competition, and which had served him in 41 consecutive undefeated exchanges. His feet were precisely shoulder-width apart. His weight distribution was 60% rear, 40% front, the configuration of a man preparing to generate power from behind. He was ready. Bruce Lee had not moved. He stood with his hands at his sides, his feet parallel, his weight even, his expression entirely neutral. He did not raise his hands. He did not adopt a guard. He stood the way a person stands while waiting for a bus, and the 11 feet between them did not appear to concern him in any way. Gerald Finch, in the front row, pressed both hands flat against the surface of the legal pad on the floor, as if to hold the room down. Second one. Raymond Chu moved. He was fast. This is not a retrospective kindness to the man. He was genuinely fast. The kind of fast that has a physical signature in the air, a compression of time in the space through which the technique travels, and the technique he threw was his strongest and most reliable opening. A lead right cross converted from a feint into an overhand at the last quarter second, the kind of combination that had ended exchanges before they had properly begun on 12 separate documented occasions. It did not reach. Bruce Lee slipped it. The word slip does not do the movement justice. He moved his head 4 inches to the left, and the overhand passed through the space his right ear had occupied a quarter second before, and his feet did not move, and his hands remained at his sides, and he watched Raymond Chu's arm extend past his face with a patience that belonged, more properly, to the act of watching a tree branch move in wind. Second 2. Raymond Chu reset. He was too experienced to be rattled by a slip. He recalibrated the distance, which was now 9.5 feet, and he moved into his secondary sequence, a jab-cross rear leg kick combination he had drilled for 7 years. The kind of combination that produced its effectiveness from the way each element concealed the next. The jab masking the cross masking the kick. The whole sequence arriving at 3 different levels in under 1 second. A fight is not 2 men exchanging techniques. A fight is a negotiation about distance, and the man who controls the geometry controls the conversation. Raymond Chu's secondary sequence required a specific spatial relationship between himself and his opponent, and that specific spatial relationship required his opponent to remain in the position he had occupied at the beginning of the sequence. Bruce Lee did not remain in that position. By the time the jab arrived at the point in space where Bruce Lee's chin had been, Bruce Lee was 4 inches closer than he had been when the jab was thrown, and inside a kick's useful range, and Raymond Chu's rear leg was already committed. The kick missed by 7 inches. Second 3. A man standing in the back row. A judo instructor named Calvin Marsh, who had competed internationally for 8 years, pressed both hands against his mouth and did not lower them for the remainder of the exchange. Raymond Chu understood, in the way that only the very skilled understand such things, immediately and without the comfort of gradual realization, what was happening. He understood that he was not being countered. He was being read. There is a distinction between these 2 things that most people never encounter in a live engagement. And the distinction is this: a counter is a response to what you have done, and a reading is a response to what you are about to do. And a man who is being read experiences something that resembles, more than anything else, the sensation of already having lost without yet having thrown his final technique. He threw his final technique. It was a spinning back kick, his signature, the technique for which he was most known in competition, a movement he had spent 11 years refining, and on its best day it generated enough force to move a heavy bag 18 inches on its chain. He threw it with everything he had, because he understood by then that everything was what was required. Bruce Lee was no longer in front of him, he was beside him. He had moved laterally in the same fraction of a second that the spin had committed Raymond Chu's back to the room. And he was standing at Raymond Chu's left shoulder, and his right hand was extended at the level of Raymond Chu's left temple, and it was not moving. It was not moving because it had stopped 1 inch from the temple, held there. Still, the room made no sound. Calvin Marsh lowered his hands from his mouth very slowly and looked at the two men on the floor as if he was not entirely certain that what he was seeing was continuous with the laws he understood the physical world to operate under. Bruce Lee held the position for 4 seconds. Then he withdrew his hand. He stepped back 2 paces. He looked at Raymond Chu, who had turned to face him, and the expression on Raymond Chu's face was not anger, and was not embarrassment, and was not defeat in the way most people understand defeat. It was the expression of a man who has received, very suddenly and very completely, information he had not previously possessed. Bruce Lee extended his right hand, not in the form of a handshake, palm up, open, an extension toward rather than a grasp. Raymond Chu looked at the hand for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Bruce Lee's face. Then he looked back at the hand. He took it. He held it for a moment, and something moved across his expression that the witnesses in the room would each describe differently in the years that followed, but which every one of them described as real. Then he said something. He said it quietly, without the microphone, directed only at the man standing close enough to hear it, and Bruce Lee nodded once, and that was all. What Raymond Chu said in that moment would not be reported accurately until 1987, when Gerald Finch published a memoir of his years in competition officiating, and in that memoir he recorded the words as he had lip-read them from 4 feet away. They were, "I have been wrong about what I thought I knew." Bruce Lee turned and walked off the demonstration floor. He descended the 2 steps. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and he draped it over his arm without putting it on, and he walked toward the side exit, through which he had entered. As he passed the 3rd row, Calvin Marsh reached out and placed his hand briefly on Bruce Lee's left shoulder. He did not say anything. He simply made contact, and then he let his hand fall, and Bruce Lee continued toward the door without breaking his pace. Yip Kin remained in his chair. He did not look up as Bruce Lee passed. He looked at the floor in front of his feet, with his hands folded in his lap, and his expression was entirely unchanged from the expression he had worn when Raymond Chu had said his name from the microphone. He looked like a man sitting in a garden, waiting for something that had not yet arrived, but was no longer in question. Bruce Lee did not speak publicly about what happened at the Los Angeles Athletic Club on March 9, 1971. He did not mention it in interviews. He did not mention it in correspondence. He continued to visit the Hill Street studio above the hardware store, and he continued to ask only to watch. And Yip Kin continued to teach his 12 students in the rented space, and neither man acknowledged the evening in any way that was ever recorded. Raymond Chu did not compete again. This is not the ending it might appear to be. He opened a school in Pasadena 18 months after that night, and the school was known in the years that followed for producing students of unusually careful temperament, students who were praised by their eventual instructors for a quality that was difficult to name, but was described consistently as knowing what they did not know. The school operated for 22 years. Raymond Chu retired from teaching in 1994 and moved to Portland, and by all accounts lived there quietly until his death in 2018. Gerald Finch's memoir sold 4,000 copies in its first printing. The chapter containing the account of that evening in Chinatown was the chapter most frequently cited in the letters the publisher received. One letter came from a martial arts instructor in Melbourne who had been teaching for 30 years, and who wrote that reading the account had caused him to sit in his car outside his school for 40 minutes before going inside to teach his class. He did not explain what he had been thinking about during those 40 minutes. He did not need to. Calvin Marsh went on to coach 2 Olympic judo competitors. He spoke of the evening once, in a recorded interview given in 1998, and he said only this, that the most important thing he had seen in his career was not a technique. He said it was the specific expression on a man's face at the moment of understanding, and that he had seen it clearly from 4 feet away, and that he had spent the following 30 years trying to produce that expression in his own students. The oral history that spread from that gymnasium did not remain accurate. By 1975, it had acquired details that were not present. A larger crowd, a longer exchange, a verbal confrontation that preceded the physical one. By 1982, the crowd had grown to 800 in some tellings. By 1995, there were versions that placed the encounter outdoors, on a film set, in front of several hundred industry professionals. The event survived its own inflation. The core of it remained true, because the witnesses who were actually present, Gerald Finch and Calvin Marsh, and the 410 others who sat in the folding chairs that night, never disputed the center of it, only the edges, and the center needed no embellishment. What happened in 11 feet of space, in 17 seconds, on a raised demonstration floor in the Chinatown district of Los Angeles, was not a victory. It was a lesson, and it was given freely, and the man to whom it was given received it freely, and the man who gave it left without taking credit for it. And perhaps that is the point toward which this story has always been moving. The question Raymond Chu had posed from the microphone was reasonable. What cannot be demonstrated should not be vouched for. He was not wrong about that. What he had not accounted for was the possibility that the demonstration he had requested had already been given, in a different room, over 11 months of watching without asking for anything, and that the man beside Yip Kin that evening had been vouching for something he had already verified. In his own way, in his own time, to his own standard. Certainty, without that verification, is not confidence. It is a story a man tells about what he believes he could do if the conditions were right. The distance between that story and what actually happens when the conditions arrive is in most cases 17 seconds. Next week, we are going to talk about the night Muhammad Ali walked into a martial arts gymnasium in Chicago and what the instructor said to him that Ali repeated, privately, to his own trainer for the remainder of his career.